Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Max with BuzzTox here, and I am back with a Game of Thrones Season 8 Episode 2 breakdown video. Now I'm going to be honest, this is a short video. There isn't much to break down, there's not much to analyze, because the whole purpose of this episode was just to spend time with these characters one last time. Because Episode 3 is going to be a doozy. This episode did some table setting to set up Episode 3, but more importantly, we just finally got to see these interactions between characters that we've been waiting for years to see. But that being said, there are still some hints on what we could expect for the upcoming episodes. And first, we start with Jaime in the Great Hall for his trial. Obviously, Daenerys is pissed because Jaime killed her father, and the key characters in the room that are defending Jaime is Tyrion, which is Daenerys' hand, and Brienne, which is Sansa's right-hand lady. Bran continues to be weird and makes a very sly comment to Jaime. I think this scene is Bran just trolling Jaime, trying to make him really nervous that he's going to rat him out. But I think that really feeds into the importance of Jaime Lannister and what he means to this season, and why Bran sees it important to keep him alive. And we'll get more into that later. But Bran ends up speaking for Jaime, and I think this is really the start of Jaime's full redemption arc. And throughout this whole episode, we see Jaime trying to make amends for his past actions. And that arc really started last season when he decided to leave Cersei. Because like his interaction with Tyrion, he's been lying to himself about her for so long. But because of Brienne, Sansa decides to trust Jaime. And then Daenerys seeks Jon's counsel, who's now the Warden of the North. And he has some very intelligent things to say.
We need every man we can get.
Well said, Jon. And I think Daenerys is in a very rough spot in this episode. First of all, Jon is ignoring her. Secondly, she feels like her counsel is against her. And her right-hand man, Tyrion, is constantly guiding her in the wrong direction. And on top of all of that, everybody hates her in the North. So I think in episode 3, she's really going to have to prove that she will fight for the North. And that is an opportunity where she could gain their loyalty. But the key issue now is that there's a secret that Jon is a Targaryen, who is more of a legitimate heir than she is. So even though she could potentially gain the North's trust, it might not be enough because Jon Snow is also a Targaryen. But he is also a Stark. But then Daenerys gets really upset with Tyrion, and this is like the third time she's been mad at him. Because to be honest, I don't know what they're doing with Tyrion over the last couple seasons. And I don't know what the hell he's thinking. He's known as such an intelligent and logical character, but yet he's making so many illogical moves. And I think that's because the basis of his decision-making is coming from a place of sympathy. And Tyrion's want to bring everyone together and make the world a better place and break the wheel is valid. But in doing so, he's putting Daenerys in a very vulnerable position. She's the mother of dragons who can't use her dragons effectively, because she has to be different than everyone else before her. So based on Tyrion messing up so much, I hope he is going to have a redemption arc, and it seems like he is. With Daenerys' interaction with Jorah, he makes it clear that Tyrion does make mistakes, but he learns from them. And he asks Daenerys to forgive him. I'm waiting for that moment where Tyrion makes a decision or has a plan that actually positively affects the plot. Tyrion has to have one moment before this season is over. And then we see a scene between Gendry and Arya, and it's really setting up their romantic scene later in the episode. And basically they talk about death. And in this scene, Arya seems very strong. She's seen many faces, and she's looking forward to seeing this one. But based on the trailer, we know she's going to be scared out of her mind. And I think that really puts everyone into context. But episode 3 is going to strip our characters down to the core. And I think we're going to see that with Arya. And whether it's just the fear factor of fighting the dead, or maybe they have to fight their own loved ones. And that's like psychological warfare, and we saw that in Hardhome. We met this character, who I forget her name, and she ended up just dying because she refused to kill the children. But then we go back to the Weirwood Tree and Bran is still sitting staring at something. And this is a part of Jaime's arc. He's going there to apologize to Bran. He's trying to make amends for his past actions. And in doing so, Jaime asked why Bran spared his life, keeping the information of pushing him out of the window private. And Bran says if he did, then Jaime wouldn't be able to fight with him. But then Jaime asks about afterwards, hoping that Bran would keep his mouth shut after the fight for the dead. But then Bran's a little bit sly. He asks how Jaime even knows that there's an afterwards. And first of all, I think Bran is trolling Jaime quite a bit. And I think there's a little bit that we can unpack with Bran's ability. Sure, Bran is the three-eyed raven and we always see him travel to the past. He's known as the world's memory. But there are a couple key scenes where we see Bran actually see the future. Bran sees the wildfire blow up under the Sept of Baelor before it happens. He sees a dragon flying over King's Landing. But most importantly, he sees the throne covered in snow with the destroyed King's Landing and Red Keep. So somehow, some way, Bran can see future events. And much like we see with the Red Priests, how they take focus on certain characters because they have a part to play, I think Bran could be doing this in some sort of way with Jaime. I think Jaime plays more of a pivotal role than just being a person fighting against the dead at Winterfell, and I think Bran knows it. And as we've seen with Bran, he constantly goes back to see Jon and Jon's heritage and the story of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. And it seems almost like defeating the Night King is just as important as Jon Snow's heritage and who will sit the throne. And I think Bran could be keeping Jaime alive in this respect. He knows that Jaime has a pivotal part to play in defeating Cersei. And I personally think it's him fulfilling the role of the Valonqar. If you want to know my breakdown about why Jaime's the Valonqar, check out my video on who will die. It's a very tragic video. But I think the key thing is with Jaime is that he was always known as the Kingslayer. The one good deed he ever made in his life, he was hated for it. Nobody has fond memories of Jaime. And I think Jaime's key role is he's going to sacrifice himself that will change the course of history, and Jaime will be remembered honorably for it. But then moving on, we see Tyrion walking around Winterfell. And we see a lot of preparation and how they're going to prepare for episode 3. We see a lot of weapons, but more importantly, we see barriers and barricades. What's important with this, and I think this is very smart, they're sticking dragonglass to everything. They're nailing dragonglass to barriers on top of the castle battlements, as well as they're creating tubes almost on the castle walls that have dragonglass on it. So when the horde of White Walkers tries to climb up the wall, or runs into any barriers, they will be killed immediately by the dragonglass. So it's good preparation. And on top of that, we learn that they have a trench. And we see Grey Worm digging or working on a trench in this image. But more importantly, we see a bridge. I think that this bridge could be made out of dragonglass. We know that Brienne's going to be leading her team on the left flank with Jaime and Pod. We know that Grey Worm is going to be leading the Unsullied. We know that Jorah is going to be leading some of the Northerners. And they're going to be outside of Winterfell. I think once they light the trench to protect Winterfell, if there's anybody that's trapped outside of the trench, they could use those dragonglass bridges to run over. And then we see the bridge collapse. And that's the perfect way to protect themselves from the Whites. So basically, they're prepared for every eventuality. For every 100 men that they get taken from them, they could probably kill 10,000. The only question is, will there be the Night King and the Dragon? Because that will change the circumstance substantially. But then we see a great scene with Jaime and Tyrion, just kind of talking about Daenerys, and then we get a cool flashback to season 1 on how Tyrion wants to die at 80. But then we see Jaime looking at Brienne, and then there's a scene between them. We see Podrick fight like a badass, so it's going to be really cool seeing him fight in episode 3. Brienne discusses her plan that if they stay together on the left flank, they could push the Whites back, and we know that that's not going to happen. They're going to retreat back into Winterfell while it burns. And you can check out my breakdown video on how I think that will happen. But I think the core of this scene is that Jaime is extremely humbled, and he asks to be under her command, which is huge. But then Daenerys is sulking in her room, and Jorah comes to visit her. And he basically says that she should forgive Tyrion because he learns from his mistakes, and I better hope that he does. But after all that, Jorah suggests one other thing, and then it cuts immediately to Daenerys seeing Sansa. And I think what Jorah suggested was to rebuild a relationship between her and Sansa. And if anybody understands the Northerner relationship, it is Jorah, because he is a Mormont. He understands the North and how it works, and how the people are. Building a relationship with Sansa is very important. Because at this point, she represents the North's political interests. Jon doesn't. Jon just wants to kill the White Walkers. And that scene between them was almost successful. And I think that's the key here, is she thought that Tyrion should have never trusted Cersei, but Sansa puts it back on her and says that she shouldn't have. And that is true. It was her decision to trust Cersei. And this may be a bit of a scar for Daenerys, because this was a mistake that was made because she trusted her counsel. And she is known for listening to her counsel. But maybe she'll hit a point where she feels like she needs to make a decision. Because the last decision she made for herself against Tyrion's counsel was going north of the Wall to save Jon and everyone else from the White Walkers. She may make another rash decision without her counsel, and it may be a very positive thing, but it also may lead to her detriment later. But really their conversation boils down to men do stupid things when they are in love. And Sansa had first-hand experience with that with Robb Stark, which led to the Red Wedding. And Daenerys really asks who's manipulating who, because now all she wanted was the throne and she's here fighting a war that isn't hers. But this scene immediately comes to an end when Sansa asks what will happen to the North afterwards. And I think that's the biggest thing, that Sansa cannot be manipulated, and she's been trained to see the worst in people and see their motivations. And I find it funny how Daenerys doesn't even try. She's just immediately angry because she knows Sansa will not support Daenerys as queen and she wants to be independent. So that'll raise a ton of implications later, especially if Jon's heritage comes forward. And there's some good foreshadowing here when Daenerys says that she loves Jon and she trusts him, which makes him telling her that his name is Aegon Targaryen hold a little more weight. But then we see a great scene when Theon arrives, and I love seeing this relationship between Sansa and Theon. And I think this is an important scene, because Yara did get the Iron Islands in Daenerys' name, but Theon isn't there for Daenerys, he's there for the Starks. And I think that shows a really interesting power divide between who supports Jon and who supports Daenerys. But then we see Davos feeding food to a girl who has a very scarred up face. And I think there are multiple themes in this scene. It kind of speaks to the tragedy of war. But on top of that, it's kind of showing that women power aspect where in this world, women cannot fight. They cannot take leadership. And we're seeing that start to change. And I think that hints more to a democratic society. Because this little girl now can look up to Queen Daenerys. She can look up to Sansa. She can look up to Lady Mormont. And I think the scar is very significant because obviously that hints back to Shireen. And we see Davos having that reaction when he sees her. Do I think this is Melisandre? I have no idea. I think it would be a very weird scene, revealing that she is wearing glamour. But I think Melisandre has a bigger role than that, and I think she could come to Westeros with the Fiery Hand or some type of Lord of Light army. And maybe it's in episode 3. But then Tormund and Dolorous Edd arrive, and they tell Jon that they don't have long until the Night King comes. And then we see everyone preparing for battle, and then they plan their strategy. And I'm not sure how I feel about this strategy. I feel like it was just kind of thrown together, even though they're very prepared for the White Walker threat. But I am hoping that they do not defeat the Whites and the White Walkers in episode 3. I feel like it would be so rushed. And I feel like episode 3 cannot be a triumphant episode. It needs to knock our characters back and pretty much give us no hope. But basically, Bran's genius idea is to be bait. He knows that the Night King tried to come after him before, and the fact that he's been marked suggests that the Night King is coming to kill him. And that's my one issue with Bran. He's pissing me off. Because he's spent all of his time watching Jon Snow. He's been watching the Tower of Joy. He's been watching Rhaegar and Lyanna get married. But wouldn't it be useful if he went back to the Long Night and actually watched how he was defeated the first time? I think that would be very useful information. But Bran justifies that he is the world's memory and the Night King wants a long night. Which that's fair, but how does he really know what the Night King wants? Because he never went back and saw what happened the last time he came south. But Bran says that he's going to sit and wait at the God's Wood, and Theon says that he's going to defend him. Which is a very nice gesture, and I like that Theon is coming full circle in this respect, but I feel like Bran needs a lot more defending him in the God's Wood. But that being said, I think we're going to see Jon in the God's Wood plenty, defending Bran, and I think in this scene we can see that there's the weirwood tree behind him, and I think it's destroyed. So I'm hoping in this episode that all hope seems to be lost. Whether Bran dies and it leaves them with no hope, the God's Wood destroyed, and our characters have to escape through the crypts of Winterfell. But after they break on their plan, Daenerys looks at Jon and he just says your grace and leaves. There's clearly some tension between these characters, and Tyrion seems to notice it.
Your grace.
But what I find most fascinating is after that, Tyrion sticks around and wants to hear Bran's story. I think this opens up an interesting twist. Tyrion is a clever guy, and this may be the start of his redemption. He knows that there is an issue between Jon and Daenerys right now. And he is speaking to Bran, who understands Jon Snow is a Targaryen. Tyrion may be clever enough to figure out that Jon is a Targaryen, and that would have huge implications on the plot. And Tyrion could do something very clever, but it would have to align with his motivation. Would he stay loyal to Daenerys? I think he would. I think other characters in Daenerys' party won't, like Varys. And then we see a scene between Missandei and Grey Worm, and they talk about what they're going to do after they get Daenerys on the throne. I think this scene is meant to be very sad because this is never going to happen. I think Grey Worm is going to die next episode. But then after that, we see Jon and Sam on the battlements of Winterfell, and just behind Jon we see Ghost. Hopefully we see Ghost in episode 3. But then Dolorous Edd arrives, and they joke because they think that Sam should be in the crypt, but really he's the first man to kill a White Walker, and he's the lover of ladies. I think this scene is very important too because we can finally see the Night's Watch together, and I think Dolorous Edd is going to die too. But then we see this great scene by the fireplace with Tyrion and Jaime, and then Brienne and Pod arrive, and then more and more characters arrive. And you just sit back and notice that these characters have a lot of relationships that they've developed over the seasons. Tyrion pours Pod a big glass of wine, and they have a great friendship. Pod was the person who saved Tyrion at Blackwater. And then I love the interaction between Tormund and Jaime. He calls Jaime Kingkiller and tells the story about why his name is Giantsbane, which I thought was genius. And I think it's funny because he notices how Brienne and Jaime keep looking at each other and he feels threatened, so he's trying to discredit Jaime to get Brienne interested in him. But then he chugs the milk and Davos says that maybe he will have a drink. And I think this really goes back to Battle of the Bastards because Tormund and Davos also had an interaction where Davos offered him milk and Davos turned it down. But then we see Arya go to see the Hound, and I did like this scene, and I think with these two characters in particular, they're doing a slow build. It's clear that the Hound cares a ton about Arya. Like, look how devastated he looks. He's afraid to even look at her, because he's probably going to burst into tears. And I think at this point, everyone says Clegane Bowl, which I get, but I personally think the story would be so much more fulfilling if he saved Arya rather than killing his brother. I think it's more significant for the Hound to actually find and experience belonging and love than him getting revenge on someone who wronged him in the past. And I think this scene was meant to slowly build that relationship again between the two characters. But then Arya leaves and sleeps with Gendry. And then we go back to the fire where everyone is talking and reminiscing about past battles. And I love this scene because Jaime then knights Brienne. And she probably became the first woman knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And as I talked about in other videos, I think Brienne has fulfilled her whole arc. And I think in episode 3 she could die as the first female knight of the Seven Kingdoms and die with honor. But then we see Sam give Jorah Heartsbane, and I think Heartsbane is the perfect representation of Jorah. Heartsbane really means pain in the heart, and I think that represents Jorah's love for Daenerys and her not reciprocating it. So I think it's perfect that Jorah now has this sword, and I think Jorah is going to make it through episode 3. But then we see an amazing montage of Podrick singing, and I thought this was amazingly done. We see Sam and Gilly staring at each other while little Sam sleeps. And I think this just speaks to the stresses of war. Their kid is resting peacefully and they're just staring at each other, terrified. We see Sansa and Theon eating together. We see Arya and Gendry, Missandei and Grey Worm. And then we see Jorah ride to the front of Winterfell to prepare for battle. But then we go to the crypts of Winterfell and Jon finally tells Daenerys that he is Targaryen. I predicted this would happen because Jon is the kind of guy to do the honorable thing and tell Daenerys that he is Targaryen, and that's probably where he will leave it. I think if there's any plot breaking out of Jon's lineage, it would come from Tyrion or it would come from Daenerys telling her council. But I think like what Sam said, that's the difference between these two characters. Daenerys believes she has a claim and a birthright to the throne. She's going to take the throne to do good things, but she is still conquering Essos. She still conquered Westeros. Whereas Jon just kind of walked into leadership because people chose him. It was a democracy. Jon was always the true king, but he never used his name to gain power. He gained power because of what he did. I think Jon as a character represents breaking the wheel much more than Daenerys does. And I think if anyone were to take the throne, it wouldn't be Daenerys, because I don't believe that that's her arc. And we even see her in the House of the Undying. The throne is just out of reach, and a Snow sits on the throne. And it's bittersweet because I don't think Jon would want the throne, but I think he takes it because honor calls. He has to do it for the good of the realm. And clearly Daenerys is very upset by this, and it hurts even more because she does trust Jon. But she's trying to discredit it, but Jon really stands his ground. Jon knows that he is a Targaryen. So it will be really interesting to see if Jon is faced with the decision of following Daenerys and he disagrees with her decision making, so he does things his own way, because now he has the name to back himself up, and Daenerys and Jon are now on an equal playing field. And he has given her advice before. He encouraged her to build a different world than the shit one they already have, and to not use her dragons to melt castles and burn cities. But that's how I feel about this episode. I know it was very short, very quick, but that's what this episode called for. It was just building relationships to then destroy them next episode. So I'm very excited for episode 3. Please let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.